Let's just face it, fascism will never die. A shapeshifter in its very nature, it will always, until humanity exists, find a person, a country, a society to strike. Good afternoon, this is Henry Keane and our weekly wrap-up on UATV channel explaining complex things in simple terms. The best disguise for the vice always was a virtue. Fascism is a truly international idea. Every nation large enough is at risk of one day to become just owned by a madman, a dictator, which will once again unleash hell on earth, of course, for the sake of sacred things. Dictators always make sure that no one ever thinks that they are just addicts to their impugned power, allowing them to murder, steal, and do whatever they might. Nonsense. Of course not. A dictator's power is a heavy burden. They would have relinquished it, but who else would then be holding the country together? A dictator's power is a calling from above. The power of thieves, murderers and lunatics on this planet has always been guarded by something very, very sacred. Some sort of great idea, preferably from a not very distant past, calling to a brighter future, for the sake of which it is necessary to sacrifice this very present. Ideally, it is always an antipode. Thieves are disguised as police, liars and scammers as law-abiding citizens, and the fascists are disguised as anti-fascists. Looking at modern Russia, nothing but fascism comes to my mind, but maybe it is just my mind. Let us look onto nowadays Russia through the prism of historical analogies found by British journalist Lawrence Britt, who had studied the experience of 7 fascist regimes in the spring of 2003 in the Free Inquiry magazine, formulating 14 signs of fascism. Vivid manifestations of nationalism. The solemn display of flags, pride and military achievements calls for national unity against this background and characteristically linked with suspicions of everything foreign and with outbreaks of xenophobia. In Russia, Z symbols everywhere, alien, rabid, uncompromising, flashy and morbidly unambiguous. Second, contempt for human rights. Human rights were devalued. They hindered the fulfillment of the goals of the ruling elite. By using propaganda, such regimes ensured that the population dutifully accepted human rights violations and socially isolated and demonized those who were the object of these violations. Anyone who does not fit in with Putin's ideology becomes an enemy, regardless of whether it is a person or an organization. Political assassinations in Russia are becoming a norm. People are afraid to speak their minds out loud. 3. Search for scapegoats. One of the most significant common features of fascist regimes was the search for enemies to hold them accountable for any mistakes, distract the populations from other problems, and channel social disillusionment into a controlled channel. People who opposed were labeled terrorists and treated accordingly. Specifically cruel, so everyone sees how dangerous it is to mess with Putin's regime. Number 4. The dominance of all military. The ruling elite has always identified itself with the army. For these regimes, military power was an expression of all national superiority, and they used it at every opportunity to intimidate their neighbors and increase their power and the prestige of the ruling class. Illegal, usurping, oligarchic elites' power rests on the power of arms in Russia. Pervasive sexism. Under fascism, women were seen as second-class citizens and they maintained a firm stance against abortion. This was reflected in the draconian laws supported by the country's traditional religion. In nowadays Russia, men or women actually are equally unnecessary for the regime. Their lives just does not matter. What counts is their obedience. Number 6. Control over the media. Official line only. Control methods included not only the issuance of permits and access to resources, economic pressure and persistent calls for patriotism, but also threats. Propaganda is the key to the haunted castle of the dictatorship. Enemy is everywhere. Stay prepared. The war is coming. Number 7. Obsession with national security. The national security apparatus served the fascist regimes as a repressive tool that operated in secrecy and without any restrictions. At the same time, any doubt in its activities was branded as betrayal and treated accordingly. A series of strange suicides of high-profile army of Secret Service officials are happening every now and then in Russia. Number 8. Relationship between religion and the ruling class. Propaganda maintained the illusion that the fascist leaders were the defenders of the faith, while their opposition was all atheists. People got that feeling that opposing the ruling elite was like rebelling against religion. Pray or become a prey. Number 9. Protecting the power of corporations. While the private lives of ordinary citizens were under strict control, large companies could operate with relative freedom. Corporations not only guaranteed powerful military production, but also acted as an additional means of social control. Soccer, city fests, national holidays of any kind, huge and fancy shows financed by pro-Putin's regime corporations are the means of social control and terror. After all, money is everything, the carrot in the stick. Suppression of workers' associations. Labor movements were seen as a force that could challenge the political hegemony of the ruling class and the entrepreneurs who supported it. Such movements were suppressed and equated to criminal groups. Any crime is legal if done in the name of the Putin's regime. Yes, that's simple. Contempt for intellectuals and art. Intellectual and academic freedom was seen as a threat to national security and patriotic ideals. Freedom of thought and expression was condemned and suppressed. What could contain more freedom than art? And what could be more dangerous? Obsession with crime and punishment is the next point. The prison population under fascism was very high, while the police received a heroic reputation and almost unlimited power, which led to many abuses. To justify the expansion of the powers of the police, the authorities stimulated the fear of criminals, traitors, and enemies amongst the population. Terror is not a terror if called national security. The country, in fact, turns itself into a prison with over than 140 million of potential inmates. Number 13. Protectionism and corruption. Entrepreneurs close to power used their position to enrich themselves. Corruption developed in both directions. The fascist regime received financial assistance from the economic elite and political favors from the government. Everything to protect the regime. Because the regime identifies itself and mimics it, it really seems sometimes that Putin is Russia and Russia is him. 14. Election fraud. Allegedly, free elections were, as a rule, fictitious. In real elections, the ruling elites sought to manipulate the candidates in order to get favorable results. Free election is Putin's nightmare. Never it happens during his reign. Today's Russia has clearly given a new rebirth to the monstrosity of fascism, turning into something new, yet unseen by the world.
Who call other people fascists are fascism taken to its illogical extreme as a cult of the denial of reason. This is the final point where hate speech distorts reality. This is the apogee of the triumph of will over thought. Calling other fascists while being a fascist in Putin's main practice. I called it schizofascism. Ukrainians have a more elegant wording. They call it ruscism. Timothy Snyder, American historian.
Indeed. In Ukrainian media discourse, the term began to appear after the annexation of Crimea to Russia in 2014. However, it became most widespread with the outbreak of a full-scale war in February 2022. On April 23, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky publicly clarified the concept of ruscism.
The word is new, but the actions are all the same as they were 80 years ago in Europe, because for all these 80 years there simply were no such barbarities on our continent. Therefore, ruscism is a concept that will find its place in history books, on the web, and will be studied in the classrooms, and that they next little kids all over the world will get up and answer their teachers when this ruscism began, on what land, and who won in the struggle for freedom against this terrible concept.
There once was a famous Russian writer, Saltykov-Shchedrin, who said that there could not be no greater torment than the torment of a suddenly acquired conscience. The same, I suppose, can be attributed to a whole nation that over and over again handed over its fate to executioners and monsters who parasitized on the great past of the Russian nation, and that must be protected at any cost, and as a result has left the nation without its future. On January 5th, on the website of the Russian Orthodox Church, we could all see in Gundyaev's appeal to all parties involved in the conflict to cease fire and establish what he calls a Christmas truce. Later that day, Putin instructed Shoigu to implement a ceasefire along the entire battle line. It is not a complex thing to explain. Still, we'd like to be explaining it shortly, but first, please allow us to show you this. This is a Life magazine cover of 1890, 132 years ago. A civilized world had a problem with Russia. The problem is not that Russia was uncivilized, no. The Tsar's elites were speaking French, were dressed in Italian, arranging balls no less pompous than inferior to the best balls of Europe. Elites were doing well back then, and then, just like now, none of what they were enjoying was produced in Russia. Fabrics for their clothes, the best jewelers for their jewelry, wine, watchmakers, architects of the enormous palaces, weapons, everything, you name it, back then was never made in Russia, but simply bought. Exactly as it is the case today. Innumerable natural wealth is and always was an answer to all questions for Russia. Why civilization? Why create anything if you just can sell timber, furs, precious ores, oil and buy it? Why? We are Russians. God is with us. Let the West bother with being civilized and then we just simply buy the world they create. But the fact that Russians import their well-being from abroad and their comfort is all bought would be just half of the trouble. Eventually, the good life can become a habit, and you finally have a chance to realize that savage who owns a gold mine is still just a savage. And there is a great deal of a chance that you will finally want to stop being one. And this, back then or now, is where the real problem for the civilized world lies. Not at all in the absence of civilization in Russia, but in the fact that Russia just need no civilization. See, civilization on that picture, on that Life magazine cover, says on that dark blob, I can't make any impression on it. Oh, says the world, this is Russia. The elites of the Russia always, 100, 200, 300 years ago, involuntarily took an example from the West, because the West has always been 100, 200, and 300 years ahead in technological, mental development, and cultural. Of course, there were exceptions, like fairy tales about Russian engineers who shot a flea or gun engineer Kalashnikov, who copied his famous machine gun from the German Schmeissers, and who still died in poverty, just by the way, because the Russian state deprived Mr. Kalashnikov of all the rights to the Kalashnikov machine gun. Well, just because Russia could do it. You cannot allow someone to be well off just because he has invented something, right? This harms the Russian national idea. In Russia's traditional fairy tale idea, only a thief, a Tsar, or a fairy tale character like Ivan the Stupid can live well. Russia never wanted to be civilized for the future. It has its fairy tales and wants to stay in the past. It still believes a flea can be shod. It believes in its great past that stopped World War II, completely ignoring the enormous amounts of American Lend-Lease help back then, ignoring all Stalin's atrocities against his own people, and that tens of millions of victims murdered by the Soviet regime in Soviet camps. Russia never needed any civilization. It has its own way, and it just does not care if this is a way down. For almost 100 years, Russia could not even create its own car. So pro-Putin's Russians get themselves a German BMW to ride on it. We can repeat it, meaning a victory over Germany in 1945. And to Berlin, USSR and everything that, back to the past is the Russian-Soviet way. I was in Kharkiv twice during this warfare and saw with my own eyes how a Russian-Soviet rocket hit a Soviet building. A building with Soviet symbols on it was completely destroyed by a Soviet missile. It was hard for me to get rid of the feeling that the snake Ouroboros, you know, that stupid mythological beast that devours its own tail, has finally achieved its goal and is reaching its own throat, the USSR, in the buttocks face of the failed usurper Putin I, bombs itself and defeats itself, like usually, not heeding any arguments of civilization, and even waving a nuclear club. This is why, and attributing this so-called truce from such a criminal monstrosity as Russian Orthodox Church, that is nothing else but an extension of Putin's criminal regime, should be treated just as a PR move aimed at making a good impression on an external audiences in attempt to believe Russia is a civilized country. But it is just not the case. Because if Moscow sincerely wanted a Christmas truce, it would have come forward with a proposal and this initiative in advance, and not a day before the announced start. Then the appeal for truce to Christmas on January from 6th to 7th is nothing but a deliberate provocation. Because if Russia believes that it is at war with NATO, then it should consider that the absolute majority of NATO countries celebrate Christmas in a new style on December 25th. And it was exactly the day before Christmas Eve when Russia carried out a terrorist attack in the center of Kherson, killing 7 people and injuring 58. So when Russia offers the truce, remember, Putin's Russia is no civilized country. Say it aloud when some Russians' actions can blow your eye and you just might want to see some civilization there. None there is. Everything is either bought, sold, or faked. Putin's instructions to Shoigu should not be taken seriously. Or rather, they should be taken seriously, but should be taken seriously in a different manner, as Putin expected to. All this already happened when the bombing and shelling of Azovstal continued right after Putin's similar orders to Shoigu to stop the attacks on the Mariupol garrison. Remember, no civilization in Russia. Besides, for this criminal warfare, on its 11th month by now, the Russian invasion force in Ukraine is no longer a single disciplined and even somewhat centrally controlled body, and therefore, no one can guarantee that Shoigu order will be carried out. The Wagner's gangs can absolutely disregard a decision of the Russian General Staff and Ministry of Defense just as well. And the General Staff just says it then, oops, those are not us. Remember, no civilization in Russia. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Mr. Gundyaev, whose religious propaganda is doing the unthinkable. You only just listen to what I'm about to say, and please, try to take it slowly, step by step, and watch your step at all times, because you are going down to hell, literally. Back at the end of October, when Russia began to give up our land on the battlefield, Russian propagandists immediately began to change their rhetorics about the special operation in Ukraine to a religious one. they started talking about the Ukrainian version of Satan. I think the Orthodox Church should proclaim Zelensky the official Antichrist. For from a religious point of view, he is the Antichrist. Araik Stepanyan. I wonder who told the poor bastard the position is free after all. Or there could be two Antichrists simultaneously. And, by the way, what if Zelensky is nominated at the Antichrist position? Does it automatically make Putin who exactly? I mean, we in Kiev can always arrange a testing crucifixion for him here and see what happens, just for the world to be sure who is who here. So, when these guys say something about Christmas truce, remember who says it: savages, propagandistic murderers, thieves. They lie so much that they forget what they lied about before. And that is when they actually are saying the truth.
Не буду скрывать, что
I will not hide the fact that calls for peace and ceasefire sound very false and insincere in these conditions, which in practice mean only a desire to give Kiev nationalists and radicals a despite so that they can regroup and receive new batches of drones, ATGMs and pen pads, and along the way also arrange new inhuman provocation and launch new fakes about the actions of Russia soldiers.
So before you listen to Russia's truce calls, remember who's calling. These are the same guys who call Bucha a fake. Same guys who call for the whole world to believe that they invaded Ukraine for the purpose of saving Ukraine from Ukraine. Remember that and understand, just as before, as usual and as always, Moscow begins to talk sense only when it seeks to deceive, resort to provocation or recuperate to that later. It can continue its dirty deeds. Well, don't trust me. Trust the facts. Invading Russian forces have shelled a second fire station in Kherson, with the attack killing one person and wounding many others, Deputy Head of the President Office Kirilo Tymoshenko reported on Telegram on January 6th. It happened in the last 24 hours, since Russian propagandist Gundyaev proposed the truce. Russian missiles murdered 6 civilians in Kherson Oblast, including a 12-year-old boy. Me, Henry Keane, and all UATV channel team want to explain a very complex thing in simple terms to Mr. Putin and all his slaves. We, the civilization, will defeat you, simply because we have no other choice. That blob on the map of the world, this time, it will be cleaned out. Stay safe and tuned.